How you doing there? Welcome back to Babble on Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Chavdal, Daf 24 of Masechta Menachos. Friends, sheesh. Okay, Daf 24. Boy, okay, what time is it? Okay, well, hopefully I could do this Daf in an hour because I missed my Chavrusa yesterday because yesterday's Daf was crazy. So hopefully I'll definitely going to make it today, but I also have to, I didn't do yesterday. Yeah, anyways, so hopefully I can get this done in an hour. I'm just looking at the clock. Today's Daf, Tumah and Taharah kind of stuff, which is interesting. Yeah, wow. Tumah and Taharah has so many details. Sheesh, that as I'm going through this, when it gets Tumah and Taharah sugas, I'm never sure about myself because I always, my impression, the way I kind of feel about Tumah and Taharah now, I'll tell you why I say now in a second, is the way I feel about it is that there's a million rules and every single one of them has at least one exception to it. So even if I know in principle one thing, how do I know that this is not one of the exceptions? Because I'm always unsure about Tumah and Taharah, and I think throughout the daf you're going to hear me saying I think, but I can't say for sure. You'll probably hear me saying that a lot throughout the daf, and I'll just kind of explain it based on what I hope is. Meaning I'll explain it with a reasonable amount of confidence that there's mostly truth in it, while also acknowledging that it might be an exception to some rule. The reason why I say for now is because Mishnah Yomi is starting Seder Taharos in a few months. I think maybe by May already we'll be in Masechta Keilim, and that's Seder Taharos is I think by far has the most Mishnayos. I actually recently looked it up. How many Mishnayos in each Seder? Seder Taharos is the only one that goes over 1,000. I think I might even have it. Do I have it pulled up over here? Let me see. Oh wait, what's this? What's this? Okay, no, I don't. But I recently looked it up. Yeah, Seder Taharos is the most Mishnayos by far. It's going to take a year and a half in Mishnah Yomi. Anyways, so that being the case, I'll be learning more about Tumah and Taharah. So I hope I'll get better footing by learning those Mishnayos. But anyways, today we are going to be learning about Tumah and Taharah, specifically a Mishnah that we learned several years ago in Masechta Chagiga, that says that a vessel joins together the contents that are in the vessel. So that's really going to be the main theme of today's daf, about contents in a vessel and the vessel joining together those contents in terms of Tumah, in terms of komets, all kind of being tied into Menachos. So that is what we have on the agenda for today. So let us chap arayin. Friends, we begin on Daf Chav Gimel Amid Beis, 2 lines from the bottom. Kisolik Rav Kahana. When Rav Kahana was forced to make Aliyah from Babble to Eretz Yisrael, as we learned about on Daf Kuf Yuzayin of Masechta Bava Kama, and he gets to Eretz Yisrael, Ashkochinu Livnei Reb Chia, and he finds the children of Reb Chia there. Who were the children of Reb Chia? Yehuda and Chizkiah. I imagine that's who it's referring to. The Yaziv V'Ka'amrei, and they were saying, issaron shechilkoi, if you have an issaron of flour that was divided in half, V'nicho bebisa, and the 2 halves of the issaron were put in a mixing bowl, and they were not touching each other. Right? We'll call them Reuven the half issaron and Shimon the half issaron. Reuven the half issaron was on the right side of the mixing bowl. Shimon the half issaron was on the left side of the mixing bowl. They were not touching each other. V'noga tvul yom be'echod me'en, and then comes along a tvul yom. Who can tell me what a tvul yom is? A tvul yom, for example, is somebody touches a dead sheretz. A dead sheretz is an avatumah. That person becomes a rishon l'tumah. What do? They go to the mikveh. Okay? Person touched a dead sheretz, goes to the mikveh. So, you go to the mikveh, you get it out of the mikveh, givaldik, tahor, right? I mean, yes. So, you go to the mikveh, you're tahor. What does that mean? It means you're no longer a rishon l'tumah. If you touch food, so the food will not become tummy anymore. You can eat meiser if you want. However, there are limitations. There is a reason why you call it Tvul Yom. you cannot eat, if you're a Kohen, you cannot eat Truma until the night. You also can't eat any Kachim meat. Oh, no, I'm sorry. That's if you're a Mechusar Kippurim, leave that out. But if you're a Kohen, you can't eat Truma until the night. And a Tvul Yom is a status of a Sheni Latuma, which means a Tvul Yom can be Metame Truma, can be Metame Kachim, can be Metame Kodesh. So anyways, this Tvul Yom, who's essentially a Sheni Latuma, touches one of the isarons. And Kamuvan, one of the half isarons, and Kamuvan, let's just say he touches Reuven, the half isaron. And now Reuven, the half isaron, Memele is Tame, is going to be a Shlishi. Okay. Technically probably Posel rather than Tame. Okay. You got some coffee here? Right, who could tell me the difference between Tame and Posel? Tame implies that it could be Matame or other things. Posel means the buck stops here. So therefore, when a Tvul Yom touches either Truma or Kachim, if I understand correctly, neither one of them. Usually a Kachim could even become a Revi L'Tumah. I read yesterday that if a Tvul Yom touches Kachim, it's Posel, meaning it won't make, right? That Kachim won't make a Revi. That's what I read. Anyways, okay. So the Tvul Yom comes and touches Reuven the half Isaron. Now, what's the halacha? And they want to know, Kitnan, when the Mishnah says in Masechta Chagiga, of course, is a very interesting Masechta because it's not very long. It's like 30 daf or something, maybe 29, something like that. The first 20 daf of the first two prakim of Masechta Chagiga, Ptzatza, Mamish, super interesting, Agaritas and things amazing. And then you get to the third parak, Chomer Bakodesh of Masechta Chagiga, and sheesh, out of nowhere, drops like hardcore Tumah, Taharah, very difficult stuff. So there, in Perek Chomer Bakodesh, we have this Mishnah that says, Kli mitzarif mashe b'sochel lekodesh, and the Mishnah there continues of alo letruma. That what this means is that when you have a vessel, such as we have by our mixing bowl, and in the vessel is kodesh, whether it's meat of kodesh or, in our case, we have 2 half isarons. I imagine that should be a fine example. And what this halacha is that when you have a vessel, and in the vessel there is kodesh, and Tumah touches one of those kodesh items, making it tameh, the kli is mitzarif them, the kli joins them all together so that when one of the items in the vessel become tameh, all of the items in the vessel are tameh. So what they're asking is that, okay, so if a Tvul Yom comes and touches Reuven the half isaron, and as we said, in the same vessel as Shimon the half isaron, does Shimon the half isaron also become tameh? What's the question? It sounds like from the Mishnah in Masechta Chagiga, the answer is yes. The question is that, as we pointed out, Reuven the half isaron and Shimon the half isaron are not touching each other. And the question is, as we're going to see in a second, is that when the Mishnah in Chagiga says that the Kli is mitzarif to them, the Kli joins them together, do they already have to be touching? Because of course, normally, if a Sheni L'Tumah, like a Tvul Yom, were to touch Kodesh, so the truth, forget about the Tvul Yom for a second. Normally, right, the way that it works is like if an Avatuma, let's say, touches a person, right? A Zav touches a person. The person becomes a Rishon L'Tumah. The person then touches food. The food becomes a Sheni L'Tumah. As one thing touches the next, it goes down in a level of Tumah. So normally, if you, let's say, have 2 things that are touching each other, I guess maybe you could say that if the Tumah touched one of them and the other thing's touching the other one, so maybe since it was, let's say we're talking about a Tvul Yom, so let's say the 2 half isarons were touching each other, so the Tvul Yom touched one of the half isarons. So maybe we're saying that the Kli would be mitzaref the other half isaron when they're touching, and the Kli then just kind of joins them together as if they're like one object instead of 2 separate objects. I hope I explained that correctly. But in this case, where they are not touching, will the Kli still join them together, right? Does the Kli only join them together when they're already touching, but just separate pieces but touching? And then the Kli will join them together and as if they're one thing and all of it becomes Tameh? Or even if they're not touching? Okay. That's the question. So, Ki Tanan Kli Mitzarif Masha B'socho L'Kodesh, that when the Mishnah says in Masechta Chagiga that the vessel joins together all the items in it when it comes to Kodesh, such as our Korban Mincha, Hanimile Eicha Dinage Ba'adode, is that only if the items are already touching each other. Aval Heicha Delo Nage Ba'adode, but if they're not touching each other, like in our example, lo, the vessel would not join them together. Or maybe it makes no difference. The vessel will join together anything that's in it, touching, not touching, no difference. And our case is no exception. And therefore, when the Tvul Yom touched Reuven naf issaron, Shimon naf issaron is also Tameh. I drink a stick more coffee. Maybe I should have brought water too. Okay. Now, Amalu, so if Kana says to them, Amalu Iu, he says to them, Mitnan Kli Mechaber, it does not say in the Mishnah in Chagiga that the Kli is Mechaber. Apparently Mechaber would imply that they're already touching, and now it just makes them into one unit, one mass. Kilu, the being in the Kli together, we treat it as if they are one mass instead of two masses that are touching. But it doesn't say mechaber, it says kli mitzaref tanan, which apparently implies that even if they are not touching, the vessel will nonetheless bring them all together and join them together. Koldu, anything in the vessel will join together, including Reuven naf issaron and Shimon naf issaron will be brought together by them being in the same vessel. Hoshit echod livenein mau. Okay, now the Gemara asks, what if a third half issaron is introduced to the vessel? So now Levi the half issaron has been introduced to the vessel, and the Tvul Yom now touches Levi the half issaron. Now what happens? We said that if the Tvul Yom touches Shimon the half issaron, so then Reuven the half issaron also becomes Tameh. But what if Levi the half issaron, which is irrelevant for the mincha, we already have Reuven naf issaron and Shimon naf issaron. That's a full issaron. That's a mincha. We don't need Levi the half issaron, but Levi the half issaron was nonetheless added to the vessel, and the Tvul Yom touched Levi the half issaron. What's the repercussions? What's the implications for Reuven naf issaron and Shimon naf issaron? So what happens? So Amalu. So Reb Kana answers, Tzarich likli kli mitzarfo. Look, when we're talking about something that needs to be in the vessel because it's part of the mincha, so the vessel joins it together and includes it in what's joined together. Ein tzarich likli, ein kli mitzarfo. But something that is not necessary for the vessel does not need to be in the vessel. Like I'm looking at you, Levi the half issaron. Well then, ein kli mitzarfo, the kli is not going to join Levi the half issaron together with Reuven and Shimon the half issaron, i.e., if the Tvul Yom touches Levi the half issaron, Reuven and Shimon the half issaron remain tahor. The concept of the kli joining everything together would not apply in this scenario. Hoshit Tvul Yom, as it's bo b'nein ma'u. What if the Tvul Yom just kind of, if I understand this correctly, just kind of dangled his finger into the vessel, didn't touch either issaron, did not half issaron, did not touch the vessel, was just kind of dangling his finger in the airspace of the vessel. Now what happens? Amalu, Rav Kana responds, Ein lecha dover shemitame me aviro ela kli cheres bilvad. Okay. I'm not exactly sure how to explain this, but this is what I will suggest. One way to explain this, I guess, so first of all, Rav Kana responds by saying that, Rav Kana responds by saying that the only vessel that will become Tameh from its airspace is a Kli Cheres. Okay, fine. There's halacha by Kli Cheres that, what does the pasuk say? What is it called? Called Kli Tzamud Pasuk Asher yipo minivlaso lisocho or something, kol shebesocho yitma, something like that. El tocho. This is a halacha. Yeah, it's a classic halacha. Kli cheres is metame from inside. So if you take a dead sheretz, like say you have a dead mouse, and you take a string tied around its foot, and you dangle into a kli cheres, the kli cheres will become tame. Givaldig. Now I have to imagine that it will become tame if a avatuma is dangled into the kli cheres, because an avatuma is metame Keilim. So therefore, now this is one of those things, maybe it's an exception to the rule. Maybe a kli cheres from inside, maybe even something else. I don't know. It just feels like there's probably some kind of exception to some rule here. But I'd imagine in principle, if you take a dead sheretz, which is an avatuma, right? So you take a dead mouse, you take a little, maybe like a bakery string, some whatever that stuff's called, and you tie it to the foot, and you dangle it into some kli cheres. So the kli cheres will become a rushin l'tumah. I imagine that that's mostly, or at least 50% correct. Anyways, so one possible thing that Rav Kahana is answering is saying, well, the only thing that becomes tamei from the inside is a kli cheres, and our mixing bowl is not a kli cheres. I think, another thing that I think, but I'm not sure about, I think that a kli cheres can technically be made out of earthenware. I feel like I saw this somewhere, but just that it's like not recommended, because I think it would be unable to be reused. I think if it was earthenware, I think maybe it would be unable to be reused. So I think maybe we avoid it. I don't know. So yeah, I can't tell you 100%. But anyway, so one thing that Rav Kahana could be saying is, look, the only vessel that becomes tummy from the inside is earthenware, and we're not talking about earthenware here. That's one answer that he's giving. The other answer that he might be giving is that, anyways, a kli cheres becoming tummy from the inside would only anyways become tummy, I imagine, from an avatuma in there in the tvul yom. Tvul yom's a sheni l'tumah. He's not going to be tummy anything from the inside anyways. So I don't know. Somewhere in there's probably something that would answer this question. I think basically what we're saying is that this is irrelevant. The tvul yom dangling his finger into this vessel is not going to make any difference. Okay, fine. Hadar iyu ba minayu. And now Rav Kahana says, my turn to ask you some questions. Ma'u likmotz mize alze. Okay. So now Rav Kahana asks, so we have Ruven naf issaron and Shimon naf issaron in the mixing bowl. Givaldik. They are not touching each other. Great. Now it comes time to separate the comments. I don't know, the easiest thing for me to think about is that we're talking about a minchas chote. That's the easiest scenario for me to think about. Just flour. It doesn't require any oil. We don't have to worry about mixing, bila, any of that stuff. I don't know, in my mind, it's the easiest scenario. So we have a minchas chote, it's just pure flour. Half of it is in the right side of the vessel, the other half is in the left side of the vessel. And now, we want to separate a kometz. So the kohen goes to Ruven naf issaron and separates a kometz. Does that work? Right? Because you're separating a kometz from the issaron. Or are we going to say that the kli is mitzaref, Ruven naf issaron and Shimon naf issaron, so that they're considered one full issaron, such that the kohen can now separate a kometz from Ruven naf issaron? Let's go weiter. Seiruf deoraisa or derabanan? Do we say that seiruf is midoraisa midorabanan? What does that mean? Meaning that when the Mishnah in Chagiga says that a kli will join together all the contents, okay, great, koach the tera adav kind of thing, right? Anybody could say, okay, fine, so the kli joins them together, and now anybody who touches one thing, everything's tummy. Great, everything's tummy. Mazel tov. That doesn't necessarily tell me that it's midoraisa. It could be a chumer derabanan. The rabbi said, for whatever reason, that when you have a vessel, and and there's somebody tummy touches one thing in the vessel, we're going to treat everything in the vessel as tumah. Okay, but what about over here, where we're talking about mamash d'oraisa? Do we say that everything in the vessel is considered connected, such that you can mamish take a kometz from Ruven, the half issaron, and it'll be considered like a full issaron, and you can even take a kometz this way? Right? The stakes are now higher. Are we saying that this korban is a valid korban now? Did the vessel join together the two isarons such that now you could take a kometz from it, from one of the isarons? Or do we say no, that's too far? No, sorry, don't get carried away. It's just a din derabanan. Yeah, when it comes to Tumah, we're machmir. We say sure, this is tamei, that's tamei, But no, you wouldn't be able to take a kometz from Reuven afisaron. So what do we say? So again, I'm going to read this again. Hadar iu ba'aminayu. So now Rav Kahana asks them, Ma'u likmotz miza alze. Can you take a kometz from Reuven the afisaron, and would we consider it that the vessel is joining together the two afisarons so that you can be taking a kometz from what's therefore considered a full isaron? Because the vessel joins them together. Do we say that Seir of D'Oraisa? Do we say that this concept of the vessel joining the contents together is Mid'Oraisa? And therefore, yes, you can even separate a kometz like this. Oh, D'Rabbanan, or do we say, no, it's only D'Rabbanan? Sure, we'll say that things are tamei in the vessel, but you would not be able to separate a kometz like this. You'd have to join them together into one collection, of one pile of flour. Amulo, and the Bnei Reb Chia respond to Rav Kahana, Lozo Shamanu, we didn't hear an answer to this question specifically. Kayotze bo Shamanu, but we have heard something similar. And what that similar thing is our Mishnah. The Tanan that we learned in our Mishnah, Shtei Matonis, no, Shnei Menachos, Shelo Nikmetzu, V'Nisarvu Zoi Bazoi. You have Ruvain the Mincha and Shimon the Mincha. Neither one has been kometzed yet. They get mixed together in the same mixing bowl. So our Mishnah says that the halacha is, Im yachol likmotz mizo b'fnei atzmo, ksheris. If you could still identify with 100% certainty that, hey, this kometz would be purely from Reuven the mincha, and this kometz I could separate and it would be purely from Shimon the mincha, givaldik. Separate the kometzes and all good, ksheris, everything's fine. V'imlab psus, if you can't definitively identify where to take a purely Reuven kometz from and where to take a purely Shimon kometz from, well then psulus. Ki yachol likmotz mia ksheris. The Gemara wants to be medayik from there that, okay, we see from the Mishnah that if you can separate kometzes, so separate them, meaning, even, so what we want to say is what's going on here with Reuven the kometz and Shimon the kometz. No, Reuven the mincha and Shimon the mincha, and you can identify a kometz. We want to say what it means is that if Reuven the mincha and Shimon the mincha get mixed together, but there is a kometz worth of Reuven the mincha that didn't get mixed together, and it's there on the side. And there's a kometz worth of Shimon the mincha that didn't get mixed in with the rest, and it's there on the side. And we say, givaldig, there's a kometz worth of Reuven the mincha, a kometz worth of Shimon the mincha. They did not get mixed in with the rest. Let's just take that out and burn that as a kometz. So we want to say that that's what we're saying, that's kosher. Amai achtem arev halo noga. But the thing is, the kometz that's being separated wasn't touching the rest of the mincha. And yet we're still saying it's fine, implying that, it seems that the kli is mitzarev all of the content together, such that you could separate a kometz, even though the kometz was not touching the rest of the mincha. So that's what the Bnei Reb Chia wanted to say. They wanted to say that the kli would be mitzarev even to be able to separate a kometz. On my Ravit, says Rava, maybe not necessarily. Dilma begushan amichulakin asun kimasrik. Maybe it was like a comb. What does that mean? So I have a slide over here. I have a slide over here. So the truth is, I looked in the Steinsaltz because I downloaded the Steinsaltz mamash 3.5 weeks ago when we started learning Menachos, and I was putting together an introduction for Menachos and wanted to see what a machvas and a marcheshes look like. So I bought the whole Steinsaltz, both volumes, to see if I could flip through and find stuff. I didn't find what I was looking for, but now I have it. So I looked at the Steinsaltz, to see if they had a photo of the comb, and they did have a photo of the comb. This isn't exactly the same one, but it's quite similar. So this is a Roman comb. I imagine it doesn't have to be a Roman comb, but it works as an example. And drink a little more coffee. So we have the white arrow and the blue arrow. The white arrow is pointing to kind of the spine on I'll call it the spine, the main area of the comb, where it's one part. And then you have all the teeth, which kind of like branch off on their own. That's where the blue arrow is pointing to. And Rava is saying that maybe what's happening in this mixing bowl with Reuven the Mincha and Shimon the Mincha is that you have most of Reuven the Mincha and Shimon the Mincha that got mixed together, like we see where the white arrow is pointing to, that kind of spine, that everything is just one solid thing. But maybe a komet's worth kind of is like one of the teeth of the comb that's sticking out this way. A komet's worth of Reuven the Mincha is sticking out, and a komet's worth of Shimon the Mincha is sticking out, still connected. All the teeth are still connected to the spine. I don't know if spine, I think teeth of a comb is the right word. I don't know if spine of the comb is the right word. Do we have any comb makers? I think there is a job called a comb maker, a profession called a comb maker. I think I saw a photo of it. Maybe even if I could find it, I'll pull it up over here and show that. A comb maker. Do I even have it? Let me see. Here's the comb. Maybe even I have a photo of a comb maker. What does this look like? Okay, anyways, who cares? Do I have it over here? A comb maker? What's this? Anyways, I don't see it right now. Okay, it's really not important. Anyways, so where was I? The comb. So yeah, I don't know if I'm referring to the spine of the comb correctly, but so what were we saying? Okay, so all of the teeth of the comb are connected to the spine of the comb. It's all one block. But the teeth branch off from it, so maybe you have most of Reuven the Komet, the Mincha, and Shimon the Mincha are connected, but maybe a bit is sticking out from Reuven the Mincha, and a bit is sticking out from Shimon the Mincha, and that's where you take the Komets from, but they are connected. So Rava argues that it's inconclusive to say that when you have Reuven the half issaron and Shimon the half issaron that are not touching each other, that you could separate a Komets. Rava says it's not 100%. My avila. So how do we paskin? What do we say? Can you separate a komets? Can't you separate a komets? Omar Rove says Rove Toshma. Come in here. Desanya. We learn in the verse Ve'er Mimenu. When the pasuk says Ve'er Mimenu Eskum, so that you'll take a komets from the mixing bowl, from the flour, from the issaron. Mina mechuber. It has to be connected. Sheloi yavi issaron b'shnei Keilim v'ikmos. Don't bring half an issaron in this vessel and half an issaron in that vessel and think that you could separate a komets from one of the vessels. No, you can't have a issaron divided in half like that in separate vessels. However, implies Ravit, habichli echod dumya dishnei Keilim. Komets. Rava wants to make the argument that, however, if we're talking about where the two half isarons were not in two separate klis, but were in one kli, we're in one vessel, even if they aren't touching, but this time they're in the same vessel, argues Rava, that would be fine. Right? The Brisa is saying that when the two half isarons are in separate vessels, that's a problem. You can't separate a komets that way. But if you have the two half isarons in the same vessel, even if they are not touching, you can separate a komets that way. That is Rava's argument. Amarle Abaye responds, he argues, that Dilma Shnei Keilim, oh boy, Heichi Dami, what are these vessels like? Kigon Kfiza Bekava. A Kfiza, I believe, is 3/4 of a kav, that's in a kav. Davagav the Arive Me'iloi, oh boy, even though they're connected above, came in the Mifsak Mechitzta, the Kfiza Mitata lo, since there is a separation below, no. Hakli echadumya debeis Keilim heichidami. What would be two vessels that are similar? What is one vessel similar to two vessels? Kigon arevas tanagolin, like a chicken trough. Vavagav the mifsakan mechitzta, even though there is a mechitza there. Hanagia, they are touching. Avalachad lo nagia klal tibaylach, but over here we're not sure. Chever, what does this mean? So I will I have another slide here for how I, in principle, understand it. So here we go. Here is a slide of a very old chicken feeder. Now, technically, the first one wasn't talking about a chicken feeder. I think the principle is the same. We're going to use a very old chicken feeder for our example. I think it should work just fine, with a few amendments. First of all, this very old chicken feeder is pretty broken, so we have to pretend like it's not broken. Also, our very old chicken feeder has 3 sections. We just really need 2 sections. We need to make some what's it called? Mods. We need to make some mods. Okay? So notice that there are only 2 arrows and not 3 arrows, even though there are 3 sections to our very old chicken feeder. That is because you can delete the 3rd section. We don't need it. We don't need that. We don't need the outermost ring. We don't need that one. Okay, delete it. Pretend like there's just the innermost and the middle one. We only need those. The outer one you could just delete. Chevra, I'm working with what we got over here, okay? Now, what we're talking about, the 3/4 of a kav and the full kav. So where the white arrow is pointing to, again, this is how I understand it. I hope I understand it correctly. I think I understand it relatively correctly. So where the white arrow is pointing to, that's the innermost vessel. Where the blue arrow is pointing to, that's the outer vessel. Again, the 3rd layer, delete. We don't care about it. So what we're talking about, a scenario where the white arrow is pointing to what would be, let's say, 3/4 of a kav's worth. That's how much fits into the inner vessel. And that inner vessel is inside of a larger vessel that holds a full kav. And that's where the blue arrow is pointing to, the larger vessel. Technically, it looks like the inner vessel might only hold maybe 1/4 or 1/2 of what the outer vessel holds, but whatever, pretend it holds 3/4 of what the outer vessel holds. Okay. Givaldig. Now, another important detail here is that the walls of the inner vessel and the walls of the outer vessel are the same height, the same exact height. The walls, at least in this example, the walls of the inner vessel that the white arrow is pointing to and the walls of the outer vessel that the blue arrow is pointing to are the same height. Now, take a bag of flour, and imagine taking a bag of flour and pouring from the bag of flour into the inner vessel that the white arrow is pointing to. And the flour fills up the inner vessel, and it starts overflowing into the outer vessel. And now we're done pouring, and we look at our handiwork, and we see basically a big pile of flour. A big pile of flour. Now, a few things about this big pile of flour. A, it's just one big pile of flour. It's not separate, like we were talking about Reuven, the half issaron, and Shimon half issaron. They're not touching. This is touching. It's just one big pile of flour. Now, as we said, the sections are the same height. The walls of the inner vessel and the walls of the outer vessel are the same height, which means that all the flour that is above the height of the inner vessel and is also, of course, above the height of the outer, like all we see is a big pile. We don't even see the walls of the inner vessel anymore. It's all just covered. It's a big pile of flour now. It overflowed from the inner vessel. Now, all of that flour that's above the walls of the inner vessel and also above the walls of the outer vessel, higher than it, is higher than the height of the vessel. And therefore, that's all disqualified. We don't count that. It's outside of, it's not considered in the vessel. And therefore, you can almost like imagine if you were to take like a large bread knife or something and just scrape off everything that's above the height of the vessel. We're leaving it there. We're not doing it. We're not touching it, but we're treating it as if we took something and scraped it all off, in which case, basically the point is, the 2 sections of flour are separate. Because you basically have essentially because again, even though they're connected, we can't treat them as being connected because they're connected by the overflow, and the overflow is higher than the height of the vessel, so that overflow is outside of the airspace of the vessel. We can't count that. The only things that we can count is the flour that's in the vessel. The flour that's in the vessel means it's contained within the walls of the vessel, which are separated, the inner vessel and the outer vessel. So that's talking about where you have one kli, but they're separate. They're separated by the wall. They're not connected. They're not touching. However, what would be, okay, so that you can't separate the komets from. So that you cannot separate the komets from. I don't even remember what we're talking about. Right, because we said, right, you can't use, right, because we said Ve'her Mimenu, and you can't have flour in two vessels. This would be the flour in two vessels that you can't have. This would be the flour in the two vessels that you can't have. So it's all this one kind of, vessel within a vessel thing. But it doesn't work because the only way to connect them would be to go above the height of the vessel, which we can't count, and therefore the flour in the inner vessel and the flour in the outer vessel are considered separate vessels. They're not connected. You can't separate a komets. However, what if the walls of the inner vessel were lower than the walls of the outer vessel, such that you could fill up the inner vessel, and when it starts overflowing into the outer vessel, the overflow is still within the height of the outer vessel's walls, which means that it's all within the realm of the outer vessel, and it's all connected because you pour the flour into the inner vessel, it starts overflowing into the outer vessel, and it's all just one pile of flour, so it's all connected. It's all connected, and it's all within the vessel. And we're saying maybe in that case, you would be able to separate a komet since it's all touching each other, it's all connected, it's all within the airspace of the outer vessel, nothing's above. So therefore the connection, which is happening above the walls of the inner vessel, but still within the airspace of the outer vessel, would be considered a connection. And this would be what's considered one vessel that's similar to two vessels. Because there's the inner vessel and the outer vessels, so it's similar to two vessels, but it's still considered one vessel because nothing's going above the airspace of the outer vessel, and it's all connected. So therefore, this was tricky. Wow. But therefore, the point being, going back to our original question, we have enough information now to go back and tie everything in. Back to our original question. You have one vessel, you have Reuven the half issaron on this side of the vessel, you have Shimon the half issaron on that side of the vessel, and they're not touching. Can separating a komets from Reuven the half issaron, would that work, even though it's not touching Shimon the half issaron? That was our question. So let's actually read it back in the Gemara with all the stuff that we've now done. That was a little tricky to explain. I hope it made sense. Now, so my Have'elah, how do we paskin? On my Rava says, Rava, Tashma, come in here. The Sanya that we learned in a Brisa, Ve'her Mimenu, that when the pasuk says that you'll separate a komets from the flour, Mina mechuber, it has to be connected, meaning shelo yavi issaron b'shnei Keilim v'yikmotz. So Rava is explaining this. Don't have half an issaron in one vessel and half an issaron in a completely separate vessel and think that you can separate a komets that way. That's not okay if they're in literally two separate vessels. Habichli echad dumi d'shnei Keilim, but if they're in one mixing bowl but separate, as if they were in two vessels, kilu, they're not touching each other. So you have Reuven the half issaron on this side of the mixing bowl, and Shimon the half issaron on that side of the mixing bowl. They're not touching, but in the same mixing bowl. Komets, you would be able to separate an issaron. So therefore, Rava says to answer our question, yes, if Reuven the half issaron and Shimon the half issaron are in the same mixing bowl but not touching, you would be able to separate a komets from Reuven the half issaron, and it would be acceptable. But Abai says, wait a second. Maybe you can explain this brisa about where you can't, if they're in two separate vessels, no good, but in one vessel, similar to two vessels, it is good. Maybe it's not like you're saying, Rava. Maybe it's not where they are not touching. Maybe they are touching. Maybe the scenario of one vessel similar to two vessels, they are touching. So what would be the situation of two vessels that's not okay, and the one vessel similar to two vessels that is okay? The Abai says, Abai Dilma Shnei Keilim, maybe the situation of the two vessels is Heichidami also, Kigon Kfiza Bikava, the 3/4 of a kab, that's right, so the inner vessel that's in an outer vessel. That Fagad the Arive Me'ilai, that even though the flour is overflowing from the inner vessel into the outer vessel, and it's just one pile of flour, and they're connected from where the flour overflowed from the inner one into the outer one, they're connected over the top of the walls of the inner vessel. Kevon de mifsak mechitzta dikfiza mitata lo. However, since, also we have to point out, since where they are connected is above the wall of the inner vessel, and above the wall of the inner vessel is also above the height of the wall of the outer vessel as well, so that's happening above the height of the entire vessel situation. Therefore, anything above that height is cannot be counted, and therefore the flour in the inner vessel and the flour in the outer vessel are separated. Right? As we said, kim de mifsak mechitzta dikfiza mitata. Since the wall of the inner vessel is separating the flour that's right in the inner vessel from the flour that's in the outer vessel, so in that case, that would be considered two separate vessels, and it cannot be used. However, what would be the thing that would be one vessel that's similar to what we just described? Well, I'm imagining what I described, I think, is different than what the Gemara is saying, but the principle is the same, and we just used the same example for both. We just basically lowered the walls of the inner vessel. I think that's fine. So Kigon, for example, Arevas Tarnagolim, a chicken trough. Interestingly, this is actually the very old chicken feeder that we were working with. Though I'm imagining more of like a horizontal thing, but it doesn't matter. We're going to use our example. I think it's completely fine. Kigon Arevas Tarnagolin, a chicken feeder, v'afagav de mifsakon mechitzta, and even though there is a separation between the inner, right? So maybe you have like chicken feed in the inner vessel and some water in the outer vessel. Hanagia, nonetheless, so if, forget about the water and the chicken feed, but if in this example, if we were to fill up the inner vessel with flour and it overflowed into the outer vessel, since the inner vessel, the walls are lower than the walls of the outer vessel, where am I? Hanagia, so they are touching, right? So the overflow of the flour from the inner vessel into the outer vessel it's all connected, right? Because it's flowing over the walls of the inner vessel, and because the inner vessel's walls are lower than that of the outer vessel, we can, in this case, consider them to all be connected. So here you have one vessel, right? Because the inner vessel, the walls are lower than the outer vessel, so whatever overflows from the inner vessel is still considered within the same vessel. So it's one vessel, but similar to the two vessels, because you have the inner vessel, the outer vessel. You have two vessels that are separated by a wall, but because the wall is lower than the wall of the outer vessel, so then the overflow can actually be considered a connection between the two, and that's why you'd be able to separate the komets. But in our example, where Ruvain the komets and Ruvain the issaron and Shimon the issaron are not touching at all, so maybe that would not work. Okay, so we asked for what's the halacha. It still sounds like it's inconclusive. Rava seems to say you can separate from Ruvain the issaron. Abai is having second guesses. By Rabbi Yirmiyah, oh boy, this is not getting any easier. I really wanted to be done with this in 15 minutes. Oh boy. Chevre Menachos. Zvachim. How? Okay. By Rabbi Yirmiyah asks the question, Seirav Kli, I'm just going to tell you right now, it ends with a teku. Okay? Usually when something ends with a teku, it just sets a certain perspective on where we're getting at over here. By Rabbi Yirmiyah asks the question, Seirav Kli v'chibur mayim ma'u. Oh boy. Okay, so you have a vessel. Okay, and as we talked about from the Mishnah in Chagiga, that you have a vessel, you have two things in the vessel. And the vessel joins them together. But what if you have, Ruvain, Ruvain, so we said it joins it together for Kodesh, right? So Ruvain the Kodesh and Shimon the Kodesh. And we're saying that the vessel will join them together. Great. But now what if Shimon the Kodesh is connected to Levi the Kodesh? I don't even know what this really means. But there's some kind of flow of water connecting Shimon the Kodesh and Levi the Kodesh. So what's joining together Shimon the Kodesh and Levi the Kodesh. So what's joining together, so the vessel that Ruvain the Kodesh and Shimon the Kodesh are joining together Ruvain the Kodesh and Shimon the Kodesh because they're in the same vessel. Now Shimon the Kodesh and Levi the Kodesh are connected by a separate connection, which is some stream of water that's connecting them somehow. So now if Tumah touches Ruvain the Kodesh, we said that Shimon the Kodesh also becomes Tameh because the vessel that Ruvain and Shimon the Kodesh are in connects them. But what about the fact that Shimon the Kodesh is connected to Levi the Kodesh by some stream of water? Would Levi the Kodesh now also be Tameh? Even though the Tumah really only touched Ruvain the Kodesh, which connected to Shimon the Kodesh by the vessel that connected them, can Shimon the fact that Shimon the Kodesh is now Tameh, can that now be Matame Levi the Kodesh through the water connection? By Rabbi Meir asked, Tzerev Kli, so if you have Ruvain the Kodesh and Shimon the Kodesh that are connected via a vessel, B'chibur Mayim, and then Shimon the Kodesh is connected to Levi the Kodesh via water, Mau, what's the halacha? Kitnan Kli Mitzarif Masha B'socho the Kodesh. Do we say that when the vessel will join together Ruvain the Kodesh and Shimon the Kodesh, Hanimili de Gavoy, that's only for the things that are in the vessel. Avol de Baroi lo, but not for Levi the Kodesh, which is outside of the vessel and connected to Shimon the vessel by a stream. O Dilma, or maybe came the Mechaber. Maybe look, Levi the Kodesh is connected to Shimon the Kodesh, which is part of and Shimon the Kodesh is in the vessel, so maybe it's connected. And if you say that, yeah, you know what, Levi is considered connected, Chibur Mayim V'tzerev Kli, you can skip a whole bunch. Mau Teku. But what if Levi the Kodesh gets Tameh, which then is Mitame Shimon the Kodesh via the stream? What now happens to Ruvain the Kodesh that's connected by the fact that it's in the same vessel as Shimon the Kodesh? We say Teku. However, I learned the other day that I think the way to say a tie in Hebrew is Teku, I think. Like if you're playing basketball or whatever and it's a tie, that's I think called a Teku. Which is interesting. I think maybe from now on I never really know how to define Teku, right? For a while we were saying Echveis Nisht, then I felt that wasn't really, I didn't like that because it was too negative. We don't know. Throwing our hands, throwing the towel. I thought it was a little negative. I thought it's really, people say, right, I don't know if this is really correct, but like Tishvu Yeshiv Teutze Kushas Vibayas or something. Titars Kushas Vibayas, Eliyahu and Avi will answer first, which is more positive and forward thinking. So that's what we've been saying. We're saying let's go weiter. That's what we've been saying. But maybe we'll just say it's a tie. It doesn't really make sense, but okay, whatever. It's a tie. I mean, nothing about Teku tends to make sense anyways. So it's a tie. Moving on. Boy, Rava asks a kasha. Issaron shechilkoi. Okay, so you have an issaron of flour that's going to be used for a korban mincha. Shechilko that was divided in half. Okay, Ruvain half issaron, Shimon half issaron. V'nitma echad man, and Ruvain the half issaron becomes tameh. So now, okay, Ruvain half issaron is tameh. Gival, they haven't yet been put in a bowl in a vessel yet. They were only divided up. Ruvain half issaron now becomes tameh. V'nicha b'bisa, and now the issaron is put into Ruvain half issaron and Shimon half issaron are put now into the vessel. The thing is, when the Mishnah in Chagiga says that a kli is mitzaref the kodesh that's inside of it, that is if you have things in the vessel, and then after the things are already in the vessel, one thing is touched by tumah, so all of it is tummy. But here it was already tummy from beforehand. Because the whole concept of the kli being mitzaref is that you have different things in the vessel, and then one thing becomes tummy, all of it becomes tummy. But here, Ruvain the half issaron was already tummy by the time it was put into the vessel. Okay, so then, Ruvain the half issaron and Shimon the half issaron are both placed in the vessel. Shimon the half issaron is not going to be tummy now. Only Ruvain the half issaron is tummy. The vessel is not going to be mitzaref that Shimon is not going to be Tameh. So again, issaron shechilkos, they divided the issaron in half. V'nitma echad me'en, Reuven half issaron becomes Tameh. V'nicha b'bisa, then Reuven half issaron and Shimon half issaron are put into the vessel. But now, v'chazer tvul yom v'naga ba'oso Tameh. Now, the tvul yom comes and touches Reuven, the half issaron, which is already Tameh. So it's an interesting question. The question is, look, Reuven half issaron is already Tameh. The thing is, Shimon half issaron is not Tameh, even though they're in the same vessel. Now, if Reuven half issaron was not Tameh, and then the tvul yom touched Reuven half issaron would become Tameh, and so would Shimon half issaron because they're in the same vessel. But Reuven the half issaron is already Tameh. So the question is, when the tvul yom touches Reuven half issaron, do we say that, okay, well now that the tvul yom touches Reuven half issaron, and he's now in the vessel together with Shimon half issaron, so now the vessel will join them together? Or do we say, look, Reuven the half issaron is already Tameh, he can't become any more Tameh, he's already Tameh, he's up to the teeth in Tumah, his Tumah vessel can't hold anymore, and the tvul yom touching Reuven half issaron is completely irrelevant, and Shimon half issaron will remain tahor. Mi'amina, do we say savale Tumah? Do we say that Reuven half issaron is already all satisfied with Tumah, can't eat, can't consume any more Tumah, and the tvul yom touching it is irrelevant? Olo, or not? And do we say that when the tvul yom touches Reuven half issaron, Shimon half issaron now also becomes Tameh because the vessel is mitzayif them? Abaye says, Abaye says, is this concept that we're coming up with over here of being satisfied with Tumah, can't accept any more Tumah, is that really a thing? We learn in a Mishnah in Masechta Keilim, Sodin Tomei Midras, Vaso Vilon Toimin Midras of Tomei Maga Midras. Okay, a Mishnah Masechta Keilim, Tumas Midras, Givaldig. Who can tell me what Tumas Midras is? There are certain types of Tumas that are Matame Tumas Midras. Zav, Zava, Nida, Mitzora. So Zav, for example, Zav is an Ava Tumah. And there's a special type of Tumah. So now, if a Zav touches a bed, so Zav is an Ava Tumah, the bed becomes a Rishon Tumah. If a Zav lies down on a bed and puts all of his body weight on a bed, that's what's called Tumas Midras. Now, Tumas Midras, what's interesting about it, is it actually makes the thing an Ava Tumah as well. So whereas normally if a Zav who's an Ava Tumah touches a bed, right, a vessel, a person, they would become a Rishon Tumah. But if they put all of their weight on something, it becomes an Ava Tumah like it. That's what's called Tumas Midras. Now, an important requirement for Tumas Midras is that the thing that he's putting his weight on is something that is meant to support his weight. Like a bed is meant to be lied down on. A bed sheet, which is meant to go on a bed, is also meant to be lied on. We learned about examples, I think in Masechta Shabbos, for example, however, like a bucket, like a pail, if a Zav flips over a garbage can and sits on that, that would not become Tameh with Tumas Midras, because somebody could say, hey, I need that garbage can to put Amod V'naisem Lachtenu is what it's called. Somebody could say, hey, get up, I need to use that. So the requirement is, for Tumas Midras, it has to be something that is meant to be supporting his body weight. So here we're talking about a bed sheet. A bed sheet, of course, is meant to be lied down on it. So if you have, sudden, you have a bed sheet, Tameh Midras, that a Zav had lied on it, and therefore it was an Ava Tumah, Tumas Midras. Vaso Vilon. But then the Zav decides he doesn't want this to be a bed sheet anymore, he's going to use it as a curtain. He's using it now as a curtain. as a curtain. It's no longer meant for lying down on. So by making it now into a curtain, Tahor min hamidras, it's no longer Tameh Tumas Midras. He had lied down on this bedsheet. The bedsheet was an Avatuma, Tumas Midras Azav. But now that it's made into a curtain, it's no longer meant for lying down on, and it's no longer Tameh Tumas Midras. It's no longer an Avatuma. Aval, says the Tanakama, Tameh Maga Midras. The fact of the matter is that when the bedsheet was a bedsheet and was Tameh Tumas Midras, it was touching itself. The Tanakama wants to accept this as a concept that something is touching itself. And therefore, something that, so if a Zav lies down on a bed, the bed becomes an Avatuma, and any body or anything that touches the bed becomes Tameh. And we're talking about a bed sheet was the same thing, right? The bed sheet was Tameh Tumas Midrash, was Navatuma. Anything that touches the bed sheet becomes Tameh. And the bed sheet was touching itself, so it also became Tameh Maga Midras, Tameh for having touched something that's Tameh Tumas Midras, i.e. itself. So Tahor min hamidras, so this curtain is now no longer Tameh Tumas Midras, because it's a curtain now, it's no longer a bed sheet. Aval Tameh Maga Midras. It is nonetheless a Rishon Tumah for having touched itself when it was a Avatuma, and it's now, even though no longer an Avatuma, Tumas Midras, but it is a Rishon Tumah. Rabbi Yossi disagrees. And he says, Rabbi Yossi doesn't buy into the concept of it was touching itself. And therefore Rabbi Yossi argues, no. When the Zav lied down on this bedsheet, when it was a bedsheet, it became Tameh Tumas Midras. It was now made from a bedsheet into a curtain. So it's no longer Tameh Tumas Midras, and it's no longer Tameh anything at all. The Tumas Midras goes away, and it's Tahor now. It's a curtain. Ella, but says Rabbi Yossi, she'im noga bo Hazav Tameh Maga Hazav. But, says Rabbi Yossi, if, however, and we want to say for now, this means even after having lied down on the bed, so if the Zav lied down on the bed, and the bed became Tameh Tumas Midras, and then afterwards, the Zav touched the bed, adding onto it Tumas Maga as well, which is a Rishon L'Tumah. So now, right? So by doing so, at the time, there was no practical implication of it now being a Rishon L'Tumah, right? Because it has the highest level of Tumah, which is Midras, which is an Avatuma. So Zav is an Avatuma. He lied down on the bedsheet. The bedsheet became Tameh Tumas Midras, which is an Avatuma. So the bedsheet's an Avatuma. He then touched the bedsheet, making it also Rishon L'Tumah, which doesn't actually matter because it's already a higher level of Tumah, Avatuma. But nonetheless, we kind of file that away for later. What's the nafkamina? The nafkamina is exactly now. If he decides that the bedsheet is no longer a bedsheet, but a curtain, so it's no longer Tameh Tumas Midras, but there still is the Tumas, now the Tumas Maga becomes relevant. It's now a Rishon L'Tumah. So says Rabbi Yossi, if all the Zav did was lie down on the bedsheet, and then he makes it into a curtain, it's not Tameh at all. Doesn't buy into the whole touching itself thing. But if after having lied on the bed on the bed sheet, he then also touched the bed sheet, well then when the Tumas Midras goes away, when it becomes a curtain, the Tumas Maga is still there and it's still a Rishon L'Tumah. So now says the Gemara, Ki noga bo Hazav miya tameh v'afilu v'asov. Says the Gemara, what do we see? We see that according to Rabbi Yossi, even though the bedsheet was already Tameh with the highest level of Tumah, it's an Ava Tumah, it was still able to accept more Tumah. Even though it was completely, should have been technically completely satisfied with Tumah, it was still able to accept more Tumah, the Tumas Maga, which then showed up later on when it became a curtain. So Abai wants to argue there that the concept of being satisfied with Tumah is irrelevant, because his bedsheet, which was the highest level of Tumah, was still able to accept more Tumah. But it says, right, so the Gemara pushes on. V'amai, why should it be able to accept the Tumas Maga after it was already Tamei Tumas Midras? Lema, Savale Tumah. Abai says, Rav, according to you, with this whole concept of being satiated with Tumah, it should have already been satiated with Tumah from the Tumas Midras. Why was it still able to accept Tumas Maga? On my lay, to which Rav responds, Umimai dahai sheim noga bo azov the basur midras. But why are you assuming that the zav was touching the bedsheet after it was already Tamei Tumas Midras? Maybe he was only touching the bedsheet when it was not Tamei at all. Maybe he was saying that if a zav went to a bedsheet that was not, went to a bed that had a bedsheet on it that was not Tamei at all, he then touched it and it became a Rishon L'Tumah, he then lied down on it and then it was added, and then the Tumas Midras was added to that, but the initial Rishon L'Tumah status never went away, such that when it becomes a curtain, the Midras goes away, but the original Tumas Maga is still there. But it wouldn't be able, maybe we would say that if he touched it after the Midras, it would be considered satisfied. It's because he touched it first. Right, so why are we assuming that the Zav is touching the bed sheet after it was already Tamei Tumas Midras? Dilma, perhaps, Mikami Midras. Maybe that he was only touching the bed sheet before it was Tamei Tumas Midras, and he touched it first, becoming a Rishon, making it a Rishon the Tumah, that be Tumah Chamura al Tumah Ka'il, which means that it was first a lower level of Tumah, Rishon the Tumah when he touched it, and then he lied down on it, making it a more serious, an upgrade of Tumah to be Tumas Midras as well. Aval Hacha, but in our case, the Idi v'Idi Tumah Kala, but in our case, however, where we're talking about Ruven Nafi Saran became Tameh, and then a Tvul Yom touched it, not upgrading the Tumah in any way, lo, we would not say that the second level of Tumah would stick. I.e., we would say in our case, it's satisfied with Tumah. Kilu, Rava says in the case where he first touched it and made a Rishon Tumah, then upgraded it to being an Avatuma by Tumas Midras, okay, we could say that it wasn't satisfied initially, but in our case, we're not making any kind of upgrade when the Tvul Yom touches Ruven Nafi Saran once it's in the vessel. We would say, argues Rava, or we at least could say, that it's been satisfied with Tumah and can't accept anymore. Elam is Seifa, but rather from the Seifa of the Mishnah. And interestingly, this is not actually in our version of the Mishnah, but apparently they had this version. Moda Rabbi Yossi, that Rabbi Yossi does nonetheless, however, admit that b'shneis didnin hamikupolin umunachin zel zeh, that if you have two sheets that are folded up and stacked one on top of the other, because the halacha with Tumas Midras is that it's what's called metami tachton ke'elyon. If a zav lies down on a bed that is at the top of a stack of 10 beds, all 10 beds are going to be Tamei Tumas Midras and be an Avatuma. And therefore, if you have two sheets that are folded up and stacked one on top of the other, and the zav sits on the top of the two sheets, so both sheets will be an avatuma, both sheets will be mitame tumas midras. The yashav zav alein, the zav sits on the top sheet, shea elyon tame midras, that the top one is going to be tame tumas midras, will be an avatuma. The atachton Tamei Midras, and the bottom one is also going to be Tamei Tumas Midras, Maga Midras, but also the bottom one is not only Tamei Tumas Midras, but it's also touching the top one, right? So Rabbi Yossi says, look, when it's touching itself, I don't buy that. But in this case, the bottom one is literally touching the top one, and therefore, it's not only Tamei Midras, because, right, when the Zav sits on both of them, they both become Tamei Tumas Midras, but the bottom one, in addition to be Tamei Tumas Midras, is also Tamei Tumas Maga Midras for touching the top one. But V'amai Lema Savale Tumah. But why should the bottom one, in addition to already being Tamei Tumas Midras, is also Tamei Maga Midras for touching the top one? But once it's Tamei Tumas Midras, it should be all satisfied, apparently, with Tumah. How could it now become a Rishon Tumah as well for Maga Midras? Well, Abai would say, good try. However, in the case of sitting on both sheets, all of the Tumah is happening in one shot. And therefore we could say it's not like the Tumas Maga Midras is happening once it was already Tamei Tumas Midras. No, it's all the Tumah happened all at once. And therefore we're saying the bottom one all at once becomes Tamei Tumas Midras as well as Maga Midras. But in our case, where Reuven the half issaron was touched before it went into the vessel, and then goes into the vessel and is touched again, argues Abaye, we could say that it's already filled up with Tumah, and it can't accept. No, I'm sorry. Rava would say that, right? Right. Sorry. Abaye's argument was, hey, if there's this concept of being all satisfied with Tumah, then why is the bottom one able to become Tamei Tumas Maga? Shouldn't it already have been all satisfied? To which Rava answers that in that case, the bottom sheet can become Tamei because it's all happening at once. But in our case, where Reuven the half issaron was already Tamei before it was put in the vessel, maybe it would be considered satisfied, argues Rava. My brain is starting to, I don't know, my brain could use a break, which is good because I have a chavrusa in 5 minutes. So I am going to be back in about an hour and 15 minutes to wrap up this stuff. All right, friends, I am back. Amar Rava says, Rava, issaron shechilko. Okay, you have an issaron that is divided into two, Reuven the half issaron and Shimon the half issaron. Va'avad echad mehen. And, okay, so you have Reuven the half issaron, Shimon the half issaron. Shimon the half issaron flies the coop. He's gone. Tifish acher tachtov. So Levi the half issaron is chosen to replace Shimon the half issaron. V'nimtza rishon. Shimon the half issaron is found. V'arei shloshtem munachin bebisa. And all of them are now in a vessel. So, okay, well, what happened? I feel like there's something, I don't know what there is. There's like something in my eye or something. Okay, anyways. So what do you have? So you have, okay, great. So you have Reuven the half issaron, Shimon the half issaron. Shimon gets lost, so they bring in Levi the half issaron. Shimon is now found. You have Reuven, Shimon, and Levi the half issaron. So you have an issaron and a half. All three half issarons are now in a vessel. Okay, great. Nitma avud. So if Shimon the half issaron becomes Tamei, avud v'rishon mitzdarfen. So right, as we've been talking about since the beginning of today's daf, about the kli being mitzaref for Tumah, right? We talked about if you have Reuven the half issaron and Shimon the half issaron in a vessel, Reuven the half issaron is touched by a tevul yom. So not only is he Tamei, but also Shimon the half issaron that's in the same vessel as Reuven the half issaron also becomes Tamei because the vessel brings them together. Now, in this interesting scenario, so Shimon the half issaron becomes Tamei. So Reuven the half issaron also becomes Tamei because Reuven and Shimon were designated to be with each other, but Shimon was never connected to Levi because Levi was only brought as his replacement. So while Reuven and Shimon were initially a thing, Shimon and Levi were never a thing. And therefore, Avud v'rishon mitzdarfen, Shimon the half issaron and Reuven the half issaron are both Tamei. Mufrash ein mitzdaref, but Levi the half issaron is not Tamei. Nitma mufrash, if Levi the half issaron becomes Tamei, mufrash v'rishon mitzdarfen. Similarly, Reuven the half issaron and Levi the half issaron would be Tamei because they are right. Levi was separated as a replacement for Shimon to be with Reuven. Avud ein mitzdaref, but Shimon will not be Tamei, right? The kli is not going to include Shimon in the Tumah, only Levi and Reuven the half isarons. Nitma rishon, however, if Reuven the half isaron becomes Tamei, well then, since Reuven was initially with Shimon, but then was with Levi, Reuven is kind of the glue between everybody, was connected to both of them. So all of them, the kli will be mitzaref Tumah for all three, Reuven, Shimon, and Levi, the half isarons. So nitma Reuven shnei mitzdarfen. So Levi and Shimon and Levi, the half isarons, are also Tamei. Abaye says, Abaye afilu nitma echad man nami shnei mitzdarfen. Says Abaye, even if Shimon the half isaron or Levi the half isaron became Tamei, all three of them would be Tamei. My time I'll come kulu b'nei biksa de adodininu, because they're all in the same home, they're all in that same vessel, they're all together in the same vessel, and therefore, if one of them becomes tamei, all of the half isarons in the vessel will become tamei as well. In kmitza, we see something similar when it comes to the kometz. Kometz mina avud. If a kometz was taken from Shimon, the half isaron, shiyarav, so the rest of Shimon, the kometz, the half isaron, virishon, as well as Reuven, the half isaron, ne'echolin, can be eaten, right? So an issaron was taken from Shimon, the half isaron. A kometz was taken from Shimon, the half isaron. So what? So the shirayim can be eaten by the kohen. What would be considered the shirayim? Well, whatever remains from Shimon, the half isaron, and Reuven, the half isaron that Shimon was initially designated to be with. Mufresh enu nechol, but Levi, the half isaron, cannot be eaten. Kometz mina mufresh. If the kometz was taken from Levi, the half isaron, shiyarav v'rishon ne'echolin. So what remains of Levi, the half isaron, as well as Reuven, the half isaron, can be eaten. Avud enu nechol, but in this case, Shimon, the half isaron, cannot be eaten. Kometz min rishon, shneim einu ne'echolin. Now this is interesting. If the kometz is taken from Reuven, the half isaron, the fact of the matter is, so the remainder of Reuven, the half isaron, can be eaten. But neither Shimon the half isaron nor Levi the half isaron can be eaten, because a kometz allows only an issaron to be eaten. Right? You take the kometz and the rest of the issaron can be eaten. In this case, we have 3 half issarons, which amounts to 1.5 issarons. So we can't allow, right, the shiraim, the kometz is not going to allow the kohen to eat all 3 half isarons, because that would be an isaron and a half, but only 1 isaron is permitted, not an isaron and a half. And we don't know, do we permit Shimon the half isaron, Levi the half isaron? Therefore, neither the half isaron, only what remains of Reuven the half isaron. Abai Omar Filu kometz me'echad man, whereas Abai says, even if the kometz was taken from Shimon the half isaron or Levi the half isaron, the same thing would apply, which is shnein einan ne'echolin, you would be unable to eat from the other 2. My taima, because kulu nami b'nei biksa de hadadininu, because they're all in the same house, right? They're all in the same kli, and therefore they're all considered in it together. And therefore, even if, let's say, the kometz was taken from Shimon the half isaron, so you can eat what remains of Shimon the half isaron, but because Reuven the half isaron and Levi the half isaron are also in that same vessel, so they're all considered in it together, and that's too much. It's an isaron and a half, and we can't necessarily say that he can eat Reuven the half isaron more so than Levi the half isaron, so you can't have any of them. Papa asked the question, "B'shirayim today mir ne'echolin." But wait a second. But it seems that everyone seems to be agreeing that when a kometz is taken from, let's say, Reuven the half isaron, so at the very least, what remains of Reuven the half isaron can be eaten. Ha'ika danka de kometz de lo karev. But what about the fact that there is a 1/6 of the kometz that is not eaten? What does that mean? So first of all, let's start with a third. Basically, we have these 3 half isarons, right? So when a kometz is taken from Reuven the half isaron, so that kometz is really for all of them. Which means that kometz is really, a third of it is for Reuven the half isaron, a third of it is for Shimon the half isaron, and a third of it is from Levi the half isaron. The thing is, only 2 of them, right? It's only really, the korban is just an isaron, not an isaron and a half, which means that 2/3 of the isaron is kosher, but 1/3 is irrelevant, because it belongs to the third half isaron, which is irrelevant. Now, if you think about it, for the 2, and this is where the 6th comes in, it's a little bit technical, but for the 2 half isarons that should be included in the mincha, so essentially half of the kometz is shaykh to them. 3/3 of the kometz, or really 3/6 of the kometz, belongs to, let's say, Reuven the half isaron, and another 3/6 of the kometz is for the other half issaron that is supposed to be included, that we can't say which one it is definitively. Which means that when we're saying that a third of the issaron is connected to, let's say, Levi the half issaron, when a third of the kometz we're saying is shish. When he takes the kometz and there are these 3 half issarons, so 1/3 of the kometz is for Reuben half issaron, 1/3 of the komets is for Shimon half issaron, 1/3 of the komets is for Levi half issaron, but only 2 of them are really included in the mincha, the other one is excluded, so 1/3 of the komets, which really should be, so 1/3 of the komets is being komets for one of the half isarons, which is irrelevant. So 1/3 of the komets is irrelevant. Now, where that 1/3 is really meant to go is half of that 1/3, i.e., 1/6 of the komets, should really be for divided between the 2 relevant ones, which means that there's basically 1/6 for each of the relevant half komets that is missing. Very technical, but basically the point is Rav Papa asks, he says, look, part of that komets is missing, which means the komets itself is possible. Maskif Larav Yitzchak Breder Mishashev, a komets gufa eichi karv. Yitzchak Breder Mishashev asks, and how can you even burn that komets va'ika tilsa chulin? Right? He says that 1/3 of, so this time he says 1/3, which is easier to understand than 1/6, but 1/3 of the komets also is missing. It's not a part of the komets. Rav Ashi answers, komets bedai to the kohen ta'ya milsa, v'choin ki komets ayisaron ki komets. The komets itself is based on whatever the kohen was thinking at the time that he kometsed it. And at the time that he kometsed it, the kohen knows that he's only being kometsing a issaron, not an issaron and a half. So he had in mind whether it was Reuven and Shimon the issaron, Reuven and Levi the half issaron. He knew what he was doing. So the komets itself is fine. We don't know what he was thinking, and therefore we don't know what, right? And therefore, whoever else is going to eat it, we don't know what to eat. But friends, that was Daf Chav Daled of Masechta Menachos, another difficult daf over here at Masechta Menachos. So friends, on Daf Chav Daled of Masechta Menachos, we really just talked about the main theme here was really combining an issaron in a vessel. That if you have these half isarons that are in a vessel, and we talked about one of them becomes tumah, if all of them becomes tumah, do they have to be touching? Don't they have to be touching? What if another one is introduced? Can you separate komets from them? A lot of stuff was kind of inconclusive. Right? We talked about being satisfied with Tumah, right? If one of them becomes tummy before it goes in the vessel, but then it goes in the vessel and then it gets touched, can it become satisfied? Is it too satisfied or not? Or whatever. Abai tried to argue with Rav to say that there's no such thing. And anyways, friends, that was Daf Chav Daled of Masechta Menachos. Hope you enjoyed. Cheers.